we might get one or two late joiners, but in the meantime, we'll kind of start with the formalities and welcome everybody to this Institute of Quarrying West of England branch webinar. We're very lucky today to have John Lewis presenting for us on geotechnical hot topics. Sadly, we normally would have our HSE hot topics session in March, but as I'm sure you're all aware, there's been a few changes in HSE and the personnel. So regrettably, that one was cancelled. We're very grateful for the QNJAC for accommodating this session for us instead to focus specifically on what will be the geotechnical hot topics in the industry for us at the moment. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce John Lewis. Now, John's got a really extensive industry experience. I said 40 plus in the flyer, but it turns out today will actually be his 50th year working in the industry, so a real host of knowledge. John started studying geology way back in 1968, and he's told me just before this call that that was kind of inspired by really the Aberfan disaster, which happened a couple of years earlier. John remembers it well as a teenager, and that really kick-started the focus on geotechnical issues for the mining and minerals industries. After spending 35 years with ECC and its various successors, and eventually ending up what was Aggregate Industries, and John's career history reads a little bit as a synopsis of kind of the consolidation that's happened in the quarrying industry in the UK over the years itself. So I think I've scribbled here, going from many years in the ECC, English China Clay Quarries, which then became CAMAS, which was taken over by Barden, subsequently Aggregate Industries, which of course was then more recently acquired by Holcim. More recently, John's then been working in consultancies, one of which is QNJAC Solutions, and extensively involved with MP Skills, and I'm sure many of you will recognise him from teaching the geotechnical awareness courses with MP Skills, so I'm sure most of you will be a familiar face to John. And he's been heavily involved with the QNJAC Committee on Geotechnical Topics right from the start, I believe. So again, we couldn't be more fortunate in our choice of speaker today. And so without further ado, I will hand you to John. Could I ask everyone that you mute your microphones, please? And if I could ask everyone to turn their cameras off while John's speaking. Sometimes it can be a bit distracting if your dog starts jumping up at you in the background or somebody else turns up in the room. And then at the end, we'll have questions, and feel free to turn your cameras back on. If you do want to ask any questions during the session, please put them in the chat. But as I say, we'll do a Q&A at the end. And so without further ado, John, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen now and sort of few of those detailed things out. I'll just adjust one or two bits and pieces on my screens. I have two screens in front of me, which is why I might look to my left or my right. I'll put the chat screen up just to see if anybody has any answering questions. The topic of this is hot topics, QNJAC Geotechnics. The QNJAC Geotechnics group, I'm sure you're familiar, Quarries National Joint Advisory Committee. This is a very old working party committee that goes back actually from origins in the 1990s, when they started to look at the revision of the regulations. So it has a long history. Things can go wrong. Just a slide there of how surprising things can be, not in the UK, that one. And things can dramatically change, quite dramatically. You can not really anticipate how bad things will get. And then, of course, it gets worse. So geotechnics is always really upper mind in the mining and quarrying scenario. When I was asked to present this, I thought of the hot topics, and I will be really thinking about what is actually being put in front of the QNJAC Geotechnics subcommittee in the recent years. And the hottest topic always remains with us is the one of design. Always being able to demonstrate that what is actually happening relating to any particular operation has been planned in advance. The consequences of your work has been predicted. What are the hazards that we are developing? in the design, and those hazards having been anticipated, what provisions have to be put in place to keep the risks low. And these are the main topics that I've sat in front of me at the moment. Design. There was recently a new piece of guidance that was put out called Geotechnical Appraisal. A piece of guidance produced in March and really deals with Regulation 32 and those recognition of those geotechnical hazards. Another of the things that came out fairly recently is the geotechnical self-audit, which I will touch on towards the end. Obviously, that's a tool for people actually working in the quarries to try and see how comfortable you are with where you are situation relating to geotechnical matters. Have we got those things covered? And it is a tool for everybody to use. And one of the most recent pieces of guidance that has been produced out of the geotechnical subcommittee is the selection of geotechnical specialists. Now, you might say to yourself, well, you can read all these items actually in the guidance produced by QNJAC, and that's true. So this is your opportunity to think of those difficult questions that might have occurred to you when you're looking through that guidance. And I will try and answer them if I can, and if I can't answer them, hopefully I will know where to go. But before I really delve into these hot topics before the geotechnical subcommittee, one of the biggest hot topics actually that was talked about in our last meeting was the change in the inspectorate. Now, this is left us all a little bit flat to some extent. Some of you will have had plenty of preparation knowing this is coming. Kath Pickett, Simon Edwards, Colin Mew and Adrian have all shifted roles. Kath Pickett and Simon moving out of the inspectorate, Colin Mew moving out of the inspectorate to join the MPA. That's been well flagged in the middle of this year. And Adrian moving across into the mining inspectorate. The suggestion that is that appears to be that we are going to be left with just one fully qualified quarry inspector, which is quite a significant change in the industry. That is coupled by some experience it's also sliding away from us to some extent, that Simon Collins and Paul Joel are moving slightly to the right in their careers, and so that's two of the major companies across the UK will have a change of leader in their geological and geotechnical sections. And we can expect that that is going to instigate a significant change, possibly in direction. And then the other topic that is quite relevant at the moment, of course, is in public inquiries. Those people who have done training with me, that I do tend to refer to the public inquiries because they are particularly significant in UK regulation. And for those people who have an opportunity, I do suggest you occasionally drop into the BBC podcast on the public inquiry running on the Grenfell fire. It's a very sobering listen. The inquiry has been running now for 5 years. It's estimated that it's going to cost over 200 million to complete. Those are mainly legal fees. But if a tithe of that money had been spent on considering design for the Grenfell Tower and many other towers across the UK, the nation wouldn't be facing a bill of perhaps 15 billion to put the problems right. And we're all going to pay that 15 billion. It's not going to come from anywhere else. The inquiry absolutely identifies that there was a failure in many sections associated with the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. The industry failed to recognise what it was doing was extremely hazardous. It felt it was somebody else's job to tell them that they were doing it wrong. Regulation failed completely. Regulations weren't clear enough, or guidance associated with regulation hadn't been spelt out clearly. And even though revision of the building regulations, particularly the fire provisions, were In hand, they had been in hand for more than 10 years. And the single civil servant that was responsible really couldn't put himself in a position to push those changes through. There was also a sad failure in the professional areas of the both the design and the assessment of their fire risk. The architects felt that they could just when they were looking at refurbishment of Grenfell, felt they could rely on the salesman. You're selling me a panel that will help with insulation, and you say that it's okay, it meets all the required regulations. Oh, good. I'll just tick the box and I'll walk on. And that was obviously not the case. And they knew it wasn't the case. In reality, if they'd actually looked at records and looked at the certification, they were found that this wasn't, the certification that was being offered wasn't relevant to the operation that they were doing. And sadly, even the emergency services failed completely relating to Grenfell. They hadn't recognized that a fire of this nature could occur. And so their emergency procedures failed the guys on site. And this photograph is quite sobering. That's as high as the fire hoses could reach. If you were in the upper flats in Grenfell, the only way down was the stairs. It was a sad failure for the emergency services. If they had responded more quickly and recognized the scale of the problem, many more lives would have been saved. 72 people lost their lives at Grenfell. That was the largest loss of life in a fire in London since the Second World War. It affected very badly the emergency services, the fire brigades that actually attended it. Individuals, when they gave evidence, broke down quite readily, saying, I had people on the phone, people we were talking to, we could only tell them to stay where they were, and we knew they were going to die. Nobody really wants to be faced with a disaster of that nature. Now, you all say, well, what's that to do with me? What are we here for? And of course, the extraction industries minorities had our own Grenfell way back in 1966, Aberfan. This was October 1966. I was 16 at the time. I can remember very clearly where I was. 116 school children died, 28 adults. Now, for those people, and I'll just read this little bit from the report which sits in front of it, which was this was the introduction of the report. A report which followed from the public inquiry, which was completed inside 18 months. They were much faster at those things in those days. And it tells not of wickedness, but of ignorance, ineptitude, and a failure in communications, ignorance in the part of those charged at all levels with the siting, control, daily management of tips, bungling ineptitude on the parts of those who had a duty of supervising and directing them, and a failure on the part of those having knowledge of the factors which affect tip safety to communicate that knowledge and to see that it was applied. It was a damning inquiry. The National Coal Board was held to blame almost completely for the situation that developed, allowed the children and the adults to die in that scenario. Now, obviously, out of that, as we normally in the UK, we have regulation. And regulations were introduced in 1971, and they were subsequently updated in 1999. And the industry has just sat here, and over my career here in the industry, there is a sense of complacency beginning to creep in, that we feel that we couldn't have an incident of this nature happening again. But I can say that since 1966, there have been a number of episodes where the industry has been exceptionally fortunate. If we just look at the St Aidan's open cast coal failure, Saturday, 19th of March, 1988, mining operations in the St Aidan's open cast coal broke the banks of the river. Air and water flooded into the void caused by the open cast mining. It was an absolute colossal failure. The whole of the river reversed its flow, and the adjacent canal was very nearly breached. The whole site of that, they were exceptionally fortunate. The whole of the site was evacuated without the loss of limb or any significant machinery. It took a day, over 24 hours, approaching 48 hours for the two levels to the water level inside the flooded mine and the river to equalize. And during that time, those of you who are familiar with geotechnics, they were worried about the rapid drawdown effect that might be on adjacent properties associated with the canal, because if the canal had given way, those properties would be affected. But fortunately, although the houses were evacuated, people could go back within the 24 hours after the water pressures actually equalized. And nobody lost their lives. It was a huge... It took about 10 years for them to decide what they were going to do with the site, and it's now been restored. Further coal was taken out of the site in the end, they pumped it out. Major river diversions were actually put in place, but nobody was injured. No public inquiry, no review of regulations. As far as I know, no one was prosecuted relating to that incident. These are just examples of what's happened. And then, February 2002, we have here drivers stranded on a flooded A38. The flood closed the road for 3 hours. Dozens of cars in busy Midlands Road were hit by a wall of water after a man-made lagoon. This is the Weeford scenario. Many of you might know about it. The RMC Stand and Gravel site. Guys on the site had reported many times that they couldn't control surface water runoff. A lagoon gave way, flooded out onto the A38. Fortunately, it was a very busy day. Most of the cars were going slowly. It wasn't a significant effect. Nobody was injured. A lot of money spent putting it right. A lot of money spent compensating the guys. Extremely shocked to see a wall of water coming towards them, but nobody was injured. It might have been quite different if it had happened in the night. A bus with a load of pensioners on it swerves off the line. Those injuries, fatalities associated, that would have been put, as it should have been, right back to the situation. Failure to understand what's worst that could happen, the geohazard that was being created. And we go to now to have another look. If we go to 2013, I'm hoping that many of you will be familiar. Fast forward to 2013. Here we have a colliery spoil tip immediately adjacent to a railway line. 4 main lines sitting in the background. Now you're familiar with it, I'm sure, with what happened here. A railway driver gave an indication, a report at the end of his journey, saying that he was unhappy with the line that passed the mine. And they sent an inspector out and say, yep, there's a problem with that, it's shifting. Now, only a few centimeters of railway shifting could cause a derailment. If it had been a passenger train or the train driver had recognized that there was a problem, if there had been derailment, there would almost certainly have been fatalities. Within a few days, the line had completely been disrupted. They closed the line. Again, nobody was injured. Now, the story of this one, we are talking about many millions of pounds, many tens of millions of pounds, really, to put it right. It's a catastrophic rotation. And here you can just see the image of the... now this, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this, but it's the scale of the scenario that we have to consider and say, in each of these cases I've described, we've been exceptionally fortunate that no one has been injured. And I'm really posing the question to you all. If you look at your geotechnical hazards that you have on your sites, have they appropriately evaluated what could be the ultimate consequence of a failure? Now, the vast majority of you guys will say, well, yeah, it's not an issue for us, not an issue for me. The scale of my operation is such that this could not happen. But it is worth reflecting that you don't need much to cause a significant problem on a public highway, a few centimeters of water, or a flooding associated with a lagoon. And if this could affect the general public, we could be ending up in quite an uncomfortable scenario. We have been lucky in the last 20 years. Of course, not everybody's been lucky. If you start looking on a small scale, we get tip failures that cause incidents. Here, lack of supervision, lack of design, lack of inexperience from the guy working on the job, and a near disaster for one family. A death would have been a disaster. Very fortunately, in this particular case, the guy escaped from the window at the back. And this was a site I was sent to almost within an hour of the incident occurring, and the guy was still shaking in the office. He'd suddenly begun to think about what might have happened. And a very similar scenario very recently. Lack of design, lack of understanding, lack of supervision, and inexperience in dealing with the materials that they were dealing with. A lagoon, which was being excavated out, the wall of that gave way and flooded into the cab. Very, very fortunately, the guy survived. Tip failure flowing blasting. This is taken from one of the other presentations produced by QNJAC. It just demonstrates that you have to anticipate what's the worst that can happen. Here, a blast, an old tip collapsed, covering a public footpath. If anybody beyond the footpath, horse on the footpath at the time, could very easily have had a fatality. A recognition of the geohazard is very, very important. This could have been readily dealt with by extending the danger area. But again, it's quite a critical thought that if you fail to take that into account, it's important. Other failures that occurred which can affect individuals, those working with inside the operation. Here, have a stockpile failure. Largest one at Quarrying UK. Those people on the training courses, this is a picture that turns up. But the guy survived only because the windows on the dozer did not implode. Again, it would have been a very different story for people if there had been a fatality. And there are fatalities associated with stockpiles. This doesn't come from the UK, this comes from the United States. But the story here is that they remain hazardous. I mean, if you don't recognize, or you become complacent with the hazard, it can lead to fatalities. Here, a technician was taking sampling, looking for oversized material in the stockpile. Didn't recognize the stockpile was hanging up, or actually had become complacent. Obviously, it was a job he did almost daily, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, going out onto stockpiles, taking samples to ensure compliance. He paused underneath this particular stockpile. The suggestion is he did up a shoelace, and the stockpile collapsed on top of him. It was hanging up. Failure to recognize the geohazard, failure to have a procedure in place, failure from a number of people. They should have been prevented. He should have been prevented from getting too close. Now, the consequences of these can't be underestimated to the workforce and the families of those people who are affected. But it will impinge on the industry at a larger scale. So I'll get back now to the hot topics that we were actually looking at, but do contemplate on recognition of geohazards. Yeah, and the geotechnical hazards that we've got are all part of the geotechnical subcommittee. That's where our hot topics always lie. Sort of guidance you can expect, and this is only just a reminder that you can find QNJAC guidance, and particularly the geotechnical sections at the QNJAC website. You can click on it. They're all downloadable. They're free. I'll just go back into that. Downloadable and free. But there are a number that sit on the bottom of here that aren't shown up at the moment, so we'll talk about that. So hot topics I'm going to talk about. The starter is design. Design always comes to the top. Have we got an appropriate plan? So it remains a hot topic. As always, a new piece of guidance was produced back in 2017. It's quite clear. It says all excavations and tips, however small, must have a design. And what that means is you have to be able to demonstrate that you thought about what you were going to do before you started. And I mean demonstrate. That means somebody says, well, you know, how did you arrive at your process? Have you got a design process that you implement? Obviously, the regulations, and everybody recognizes, you know, the complexity is proportionate to the danger that's posed. So everything is proportionate. If there's very little hazard, you don't have to worry over much about the detail of your design. But it still has to be demonstrated that you thought about. Here, a couple of comments are coming from guidance. Design should conform to good engineering practice and relevant standards. Design should be a working document which may be needed to be amended or updated as work progresses. Now, this is the piece of guidance that came out in 2017, so it'll obviously be a bit of a recap for all of you, but it's just well to say, well, do we have a design process that we follow? Large or small quarry, it doesn't matter. I have to recognize that I have to demonstrate that we've thought about it. If you look at that piece of guidance, the first thing that's already said is, you know, which regulations apply? Now, quite often you get the question in here, they're saying, well, is it a quarry? Or do I have other regulations that are applying in these cases? Type of construction, environmental bank, waste tip, surface water treatment lagoon, water storage lagoon, plant construction. Any earthworks project you start, you'll say, which regulations take place? Has the site been notified as a quarry? If it's been notified as a quarry, it's the quarry regulations that are always going to take precedence. If you say it's not been notified as a quarry, or it's an area that you're starting, you're saying, well, should the site be defined as a quarry? And we do have regulation that's quite clear about, regulation 33 and 3 and 4, all mineral workings, tips, stockpiles, areas used for the preparation of extracted minerals for sale, buildings, structures at the quarry that are used for working of the quarry, common areas, roadways and railways, sites where prospecting with a view to extraction of minerals. All these are covered by regulation and they are required to be considered a quarry. If it is, then the quarry regulations take precedence. If not, CDM regs will take place. Now, quite often you visit a site and say, well, we're working under CDM, so yeah, CDM regs, so we don't have to worry about the quarry regs. But just bear in mind that CDM regs are extremely extensive as well and require in many cases for you to do more work than you would under the quarry regs. CDM identify a number of key elements for the construction. You need designers, principal contractors, contractors. You have duties for the client to appoint a principal designer and a principal contractor. All that paperwork has to be in place. Now, you may employ someone and say, well, we'll do that all for you. But it's still a requirement that the client has to make sure that the work is done properly under CDM regs. If you're working under quarry regs, you have to have a quarry design process that complies with regulation. Now, the summary of the quarry design process is actually sitting inside that piece of guidance. This is just a flow chart. It doesn't mean to be this is the way that you should go about the job. It's just an illustration how you can demonstrate that you have a design process working and that you thought the whole question through. And here we're up at the top of the page at the moment. We'll say, if you're doing a design, you have to identify all the relevant personnel involved in the design process. You need to get to make sure you're saying we haven't missed anything. These green boxes on the side, this is taken from the guidance. It just suggests these might be some of the people that need to be consulted in design for an operation. Right down to an earth bank, stockpile, large stockpiles, even small stockpiles, people need to consider issues. So here we describe operations manager, health and safety committee, geologist, geotechnical specialist, blasting supervisor, blasting contractor, engineer. There is no limit to the number of people, not complete. It just depends on the scale of the operation and who you need to consult to make sure they understand what's going on. And then the question comes down here is, have we got enough information to be able to do our design? Are there any bits that are missing? Do we need to have plans? Do we need to have more geological information? Now, if you go back to that open cast coal site that flooded, they didn't have sufficient understanding of the geology. They carried on excavation, and eventually the side of the entire operation gave way opposite the river. That would have included hydrological data. And that was obviously, although nobody was injured, obviously a serious criticism relating to the design of that particular structure, failure to understand. And incorporated in here is this understanding that you have a three-dimensional understanding of the geology of the site, not just in 2 dimensions. Once you've gathered your information, you say, have we got all the, identified all the quarry design parameters? If we have, we can move to our operation. It can be an extraction plan, it can be a tip plan, whatever you want to actually do, but those you will actually start putting your parameters in place. It's a process. It's a process you can tick the boxes to say that you've moved through. Once you've done that, you'll get closer to me, because you say, well, the thing I have to do here is identify the geotechnical elements. I've got the parameters. What are the parameters that are geotechnical? And this is where quarry regulations takes a slightly harder role than CDM regs. If you do identify geotechnical elements, slopes, tips, excavations, you have to appraise them under regulation to identify whether they're significant, significant hazards or not. If there are no geotechnical elements that you can identify, then they will run round. You can actually go straight to the end of the design process at the bottom here. If you do identify significant geotechnical elements, they must be appraised for significant hazards. And we'll be talking about that in the next step, which is the appraisal system that we were, again, a hot topic relating to guidance that has been produced recently. You appraise significant hazards, a requirement under Regulation 32. If there are non-significant hazards, you can roll around. If they are identified as significant hazards, if you can't eliminate them by modification, then you have to have a geotechnical assessment. You have no choice. And just to re-enter that, once you have your geotechnical assessment in place, that may not change anything of your design or your proposals, but it may highlight what procedures and rules you need to be put in place to keep risks associated with that low. And inside this process, there may be a modification process. People come along and say, well, when I look at the design, I think we need to review it. And that would be a review of the geotechnical assessments as well. Once you've gone through this process, you can develop your excavations and tips rules or procedures for the working, and you can determine how frequently they should go. That remains a hot topic with this particular, with the QNJAC Geotechnical. And it is the most common reason that we find that there are failures. Inspection go on site and they say, well, we can't see what the design meant, how they were supposed to go about this job, or the design didn't accommodate the actual conditions they found on site. And so they made ad hoc changes to the design. Guidance that was produced in March of last year was for geotechnical appraisals. This is consideration under Regulation 32. Now, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but we'll just touch on what the appraisal system does. It's the fundamental element of the part 6 of the regulations, the geotechnical part regulations, is the identification of geotechnical hazards. You have to be able to identify them on site. Here, appraisal under Regulation 32. And the first question is, do I have enough information to be able to make a judgment call? Does the proposed excavation on tip represent a significant hazard? Now, I don't go into the definition of a significant. That's sitting inside the approved code of practice for regulation. But essentially it means, can people be harmed? If they can be harmed, it has to be considered a significant hazard. We haven't evaluated the risk. It's just whether a question if it presents a hazard. And there are only two answers, either yes or no. Protection from harm is an absolute duty spelt out in regulation 30. You have to protect people from significant harm. That sits under regulation 30. Stability, it's not going to fall down. Never been a problem with this before. These are not the questions here. If it has the potential to do harm. And if you think back at some of those larger episodes, it's the failure of people to recognize how big a problem they might generate is the one that affects the general public. Stability is not a question here. So you might come to this process and you'll say, nope, it's not going to be a problem. And then you just go and carry on further appraising it. We've got it under control on site. But if you come to a conclusion, yes, you are committed to talk to a geotechnical specialist. Another piece of guidance, hot topic, selection of geotechnical specialists. Does the geotechnical specialist agree? He might say, no, it's not a significant hazard. Not often that happens, but they'll say, no, it's not a significant hazard. No people are in harm's way. If that's the case, it goes back into the appraisal system and falls back in the lap of the operator. But if it's yes, you go down and you have to complete a geotechnical assessment, and that might involve all factors that might affect the safety and stability of the identified geotechnical hazard. And that sets out a whole series of information that has to be made available and conclusions that have to be produced in the geotechnical assessment. We have to record those conclusions. There is also the notification requirement to the health and safety executive, and that's going to be quite interesting in the future. And you have a duty to carry on assessing the geohazard that's been identified until it's no longer significant. Once it's no longer significant, it goes back into the appraisal process. It's a recognized geotechnical hazard. We run around the system. All these are covered by regulation. And so it's looking in that site. I'm just looking at a bit of a chat that's gone on there. Sorry, guys. And that's regulation 34. And just to highlight one of the points we were brought back in the guidance is that you must have appointed people for these tasks. And that's assessed, again, if you go back to the geotechnical audit, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. One of the questions is, do you know who does your appraisals by name? Is he appointed at that site? But if you are a requirement to have an appraisal done, who do you turn to? And it's exactly the same for geotechnical assessments. There should be an appointed geotechnical specialist for your site if it requires an assessment. Those two are collectively. Well, one of the aspects of regulation 32 that is being highlighted in guidance and is highlighted for everyone is this paragraph 2 and the requirement of the operator to notify all people who work on a site of the geohazards, the geotechnical hazards under which they work. This is not the significant hazards, it's all the hazards that have been appraised. You pose the question to the workforce, have people talked about the geotechnical hazards under which you're working? And many people don't recognize that phrase. They know about the risks they're taking. They're saying, do you recognize the hazard that these are geotechnical hazards and conditions may change? And we may require you to reappraise them again. It's particularly pertinent, obviously, for subcontractors, and an operator of a quarry has to make sure that people understand, or required by regulation to make sure they understand the hazards under which they work. It might have well alleviated the problem in Aberfan if people said, this is a geohazard, geotechnical hazard. We're not carrying on doing what we're doing at the moment until we get a better design. If something changes, you do another appraisal. I'm not going to go through all these slides. Something changes that you didn't anticipate, and you are going in that direction. Now, The self-audit is again produced in March 2021. I would, if I was in front of you guys here at the moment, I'll ask you to put your hands up and say who's done a self-audit, a geotechnical self-audit, or knows that a geotechnical self-audit has been carried out on the site in which they work. If you want to actually vote on that, sometime we might actually run a vote to see where we are. It's a very powerful tool. It's not tested anyway. An inspector's not going to ask you for that, but it does give you a whole series of questions which we'll have to answer, and I'll deal with that slightly more later on. Who has worked through this? I'll return to it a little later, and I'll just talk briefly on the selection of the geotechnical specialist. This is the last of the most recent, produced in January of this year, published by the Quarrying Group. Vote or not by Simon Collins of Aggregate Industries, but other people have made a very significant contribution to the selection of geotechnical specialists, because it's having confidence in your geotechnical specialist will allow you to have confidence in the recommendations that they make to keep the geotechnical risks to your site low, and their consideration for the operation. Now, it's the duty of the operator to make sure that that geotechnical specialist that you appoint is competent for the job. And it says here, whilst the geotechnical operator appoints a geotechnical specialist, it remains the duty of the operator to ensure that any significant findings and conclusions are recorded. So that means they must know what conclusions they want from the geotechnical assessment. They must ensure that any information available to him, which may be relevant for the purposes of the geotechnical assessment, is made available to the geotechnical specialist undertaking it. You can't say he doesn't know, so he didn't see it, so it doesn't matter. And ensure that any remedial works identified during the geotechnical assessment are completed by the date specified. Now, I can only inform you that the inquiry for the fire assessor at Grenfell has made it very clear that qualifications have to be validated. So if you're appointing your geotechnical specialist, you have to make sure that he has the qualifications he's claiming. It's a very significant point. They have to be a chartered engineer or a chartered geologist. You can check that by going to the professional institution. You can't just say, well, he said he was, or she said she was. And she's used those. They have to have a recognized qualification in soil mechanics and rock mechanics. Not all geologists do, not all chartered engineers do. They have to have 3 or 4 years, at least 3 years or more years of relevant experience to your operation. And so they must declare that they're competent to perform a geotechnical analysis to determine the level of hazard at risk at this. And they must be able to pass the information on appropriately. So I'm not going to go through this in any great detail, but a thorough understanding of rock mechanics and soil mechanics, not too difficult to you. Whether you understand it or not, you're saying, I can look at your qualifications, I can look at other work that you've done. Obviously, there are more specialized areas depending on different parts of the country. China clay operations are completely different to brick pit operations, which are completely different to sand and gravel operations. They may not be areas of expertise that people specialize in. All geotechnical specialists should recognize their own limitations. And it's just this very clear thing that came out of the Grenfell inquiry. It's good practice for a geotechnical assessment is peer reviewed and is countersigned to ensure professional standards are applied. What that really means that there is a quality control system operating on this report. And that another geotechnical specialist, not directly concerned with this operation, has reviewed it and said, yeah, this makes sense to me. Alone working in this area is a very uncomfortable position and can be managed in other ways. You can get other people to review your work without too much of a problem. So I'm coming towards the end now, and I'm going to talk a bit about self-audit. The mechanical geotechnical self-audit form is available online. It has a number of questions. It was produced in March 2021. It was previewed before that at a joint meeting with the Institute of Quarrying and the Extractive Industries conference, maybe on a day. And we had a large number of answers, and we went through those answers to review how people would respond to this. But it's usually a self-help tool. Series of questions. Nobody anticipates that this will be filled in a minute or 20 minutes or even like one single sitting. People may have to sit down, go through the questions and say, well, I haven't got an answer for that one today. I need to go away and actually find out a bit more information to see where we are. Do we have an answer? Or what if we don't have an answer, what am I going to do about it? And here the example, is there an appointed geotechnical specialist? I remember that if you use the term appointed, sorry about that, if you have used the term appointed, it's appointment in writing. You have to say, yep, I've given you a letter, this is what I want you to do. All the excavations have been subject to a geotechnical appraisal as required by Regulation 32. Is there an assessment for this particular site? Have we recognised significant hazards? And it'll go on all the way down the questions. Have you sent off your notifications? Are they appropriate notifications? Again, produced by guidance. That's about where I'm finishing my talk at the moment. As you say, this is, and I'll be open to questions in a minute. I do recommend you all have a go at the self-audit. It's a bit sobering when you work your way through it and you get to the end, but I hope that it will identify some of those issues. And just to run all the way back to where I was with Grenfell, we do not want, as an industry, we do not want to be in the same situation as the guys are here. If there was a fatality, and even as I say, one of the fatalities could have been the train derailed. It could have been a bus over, which the lagoon caused a crash. It could have been a house collapsed associated with the inundation at the open cast coal. Any one of those might have triggered a public inquiry. And we do not want the same situation that is developed for the building industry, particularly the high-rise industry, where not only was the cladding called into account, but the whole construction process and the design process that came to this particular level. Now I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to pass you back to Otto, and we'll see where we are with questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, John. Really informative presentation, I certainly thought. If anybody does have any questions, please do put them in the chat, or put your virtual hand up if you know how, using the reactions function at the bottom of your screen. But I'll just start first of all, John. And you mentioned, referring back to the Grenfell inquiry there, that there was a reliance on salesmen and the specifications, and the assurance is given that it's adequate. And do you think there's parallels there for us as either company geologists to go back and challenge our geotechnical specialists, or for quarry managers to go back and challenge their geologists on the adequacy and the relevance of those designs assurances given?
Well, I think there's a balance that people have to recognise. If you're a consultant, and I've worked on both sides of this, and I've employed consultants, they tend to want to give you the answers you want to hear because that keeps them employed. So there is always a hesitancy to actually push forward a comment or push it to the limit. Now, I must say that some of the consultants wouldn't hesitate at all, and so that it depends who you're employing and recognizing what you're getting for your money, and what you're getting for a genuine advice that you're being given. So and I can only say the Grenfell inquiry, the fire assessor there, he was a very capable man, wasn't formally qualified. They aren't required to have those levels of formal qualifications as a fire assessor. That's under question now in relating to regulation. They're saying there should be formal qualifications. He fudged his qualifications, unfortunately, way back in 2009. He gave the suggestion in his CV that attendance of courses was a formal qualification. So he attended courses in Northern Ireland, which gave him more information, obviously quite a capable man. But the suggestion was this was a formal qualification, which he was immediately approached by the expert witnesses to the inquiry and said, no, they're not. It doesn't demonstrate competence. It shows you that you have gone through a process, but doesn't necessarily deliver that result. I'm seeing that David Brock has an issue here, which I will try and address. But it is quite important that for operators of quarries, under regulation, our regulations, ABAVAN recognise that problem, and they place very firmly the requirement on operators to ensure that they're employing competent people, and that is repeated in regulation in several of the regulations we have in front of us. And what you have to do if you're employing someone, you've just demonstrated, how did I confirm myself that this guy was competent for the job? Did he have the qualifications he said he did? That's fairly straightforward to identify. So that's not, but that's a bit like an insurance guy saying, I just wanted to make sure, just show me your certification. It's not good. I'll just check with the professional institutions that you're a member of. Are you recognized as a professional member? And then I see, do you have relevant experience in the operation that we're dealing with here? Can I look at previous work that you've done, or who supervised your previous work, and we'll get that coming through. So those are the 2 points I would make. I'm just going to read, David Brock has put the question to me. He said, not all geotechnical specialists recognized by the Geological Society and the Institution of Civil Engineers have formal qualifications. That would be a chartered engineer, not usually through the Institution of Civil Engineers would work in the minerals industry, more like the Institution of Minerals, Materials and Mining. IOMM would be an engineer you would expect, but occasionally a civil engineer would be an appropriate person to work in some scenarios. Have they required what they would have to demonstrate to an operator, and that they have relevant experience which makes them qualified. It's not enough to say that somebody says I'm okay. That's what I'm really saying to you. You want to be able to identify their experience to say, yeah. In this particular case, they go back to Grenfell, the fire officer was very competent. He wrote quite competent reports the first 3. But then he was doing a lot of work by himself. He didn't have any partner in the work. He was producing the reports by himself, and he tended to water down his recommendations. He was extremely criticized for the fact that he said all the flats should have fire doors and they should be working, but when it was well known that they didn't, and they didn't work.
David, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to come back, or do you have any additional comments or questions for John?
Yeah, I think he's probably covered most of the points that I was concerned about. I was very much involved in the at the time of the drafting of the quarries regulations, in the discussions about the geotechnical assessment and the geotechnical specialist. And I'm slightly worried by the insistence on formal qualifications in soil mechanics and rock mechanics, because certainly the Register of Geotechnical Engineers, which includes both civil engineers and geologists and mining engineers, does not actually specify necessary formal qualification.
No,
you've also got formal qualification in engineering geology, which can actually cover what is required in the quarrying industry. And I was just a little worried about the specific formal requirement for soil mechanics and rock mechanics qualifications.
Look, I concur, David. There is the requirement to become a chartered engineer or a chartered geologist doesn't necessarily require you to have formal qualifications in any one particular area. And so it is what is being suggested. Actually, one of the hot topics that we were moving on to, which I skipped over, I think, in there, is that the contents of geotechnical assessments, and one of the requirements of the geotechnical assessment is a declaration of competence by the person writing it. So what you're asking the guy to say is, demonstrate that you're competent in these areas. You can quote your own experience, you can quote your own, and that is perfectly acceptable. you know, to an operator. You can say, this guy is obviously experienced in the work that I'm doing on this job. I can employ him on this task. So it's what we're saying is that that's what you need. The operator needs to satisfy himself, and the mechanisms for that, hopefully we're going to put in guidance to make it sure. Perhaps I ought to have made it clear in my talk that guidance is going to become increasingly important. These regulations are 20 years out of date. Yeah. They're not out of date at the moment. They are still good regulations, but people say they were written a long time ago. The approved code of practice has only been marginally modified in the last 20 years. Now, things have moved on in that time, and the number of times in the Grenfell inquiry people refer to, why weren't you complying with latest guidance? The counsel to the inquiry saying this was obvious, you know, it's been talked about in reviews, it's been talked about in publications. This is a piece of guidance that you don't refer to. Didn't you know about it? Or if you know about it, why did you just ignore it? And that is very pertinent in these cases. And so, yeah, that's where we are. So, yeah, I would definitely endorse, David. Formal qualifications, you will still have to be a chartered engineer or a chartered geologist, but in any specific area depends really on what you're delivering to the operator in your geotechnical assessment, which may be valuable.
It's very interesting, John. If you don't mind, start to come in with a question on that, perhaps coming back to that topic of competence. You know, we talked a bit about your kind of role in training.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a time that we should be kind of splitting up that sand and gravel geotechnical knowledge for managers and operatives? And
it's how much my view actually with all these things to some extent is every site is different and they are all very, very unique. You know, you can say, well, you know, you can look at it, one sand and gravel site. There's a bit more sand in one site, a bit more gravel in another. We have a river adjacent to one site. We have no rivers. We have nothing adjacent to another. Every site is different. So trying to actually have a training scheme that's going to be all embracing is extremely difficult. And so you are looking at, if you recognize your geotechnical hazards and you recognize that they're significant, in other words, they have the potential to do people harm, then you really would like that training to be focused on you by your geotechnical specialist. You can say, what do I need that's out of the ordinary that I need to know about this particular site? And that may relate to a geohazard, a tip in a particular location, or an excavation in a particular location, or the material that you're working on, the process that you've got. So to try and deal with that in a general training course and say, well, these are the ones that you have in sand and gravel sites, and these are the ones you have in hard grass, the crossovers are quite significant. So in many cases, I would be looking for in a quarry manager, someone who is appointed under 8.1c to take control of the health and safety for the site, to have that very broad knowledge. Because a broad knowledge will allow him to then say, well, I'm not hearing very well from my geotechnical specialist. I need to ask him a particular question, cover this point. Or that may be somebody appointed in the operator to read those geotechnical reports and saying, well, we need these points covered properly. So broad knowledge, I think, is very important for the average quarry manager, I'm afraid. You know, and gone are the days where you can sit in your office and says, well, I'm just doing what I'm told. I'm somebody, just tell me what to do and I'll do it, which is what the job goes. And that's what people like to say, you know, say, it's not, I'm just doing what I'm told, and it's great. And unfortunately, these days, certainly on a site, you know, it's going to have to come down to a judgment call from the guy who's there on site and saying, well, I need more information. I need to have more reassurance from a geotechnical specialist or somebody, another specialist, if I don't think I'm getting the right answer. I don't know if that really helps you there also too much, but
no, I think it's a valid point. It's a question I often get asked, or comment that's made, that, you know, I work in a sand and gravel site, why do I need to know about rock mechanics and vice versa? But I think, as you say, you know, it's a broad knowledge and understanding is definitely beneficial for everybody.
It is indeed. It is indeed.
Do we have any other questions around the room? I'm not seeing any hands up or any questions in the chat. So now is the chance if you do have anything you'd like to ask. Just in the meanwhile, if there are any other last minute questions coming in on the chat, I'll take the opportunity just to have a quick plug for our next West of England branch meeting, which will be taking place on the 9th of May. I'm pleased to announce we will be returning to a joint webinar and in-person meeting down at the Earth Science Centre. So I'm looking forward to welcoming you all back in person if you're from the branch and would like to attend. And the topic for that one will be the good handling of soils and the updated guidance that's recently been released for soil handling. We don't have any more questions that have come in, and I can't see any. Then I'd just like to extend our thanks to John Lewis for his time and very informative presentation. Very grateful for stepping in, and I hope everybody's found that useful. And one final plug, I'm conscious that some of you have commented to me from within Sunlight that you're not necessarily receiving the latest IQ emails and newsletters. If that is the case, please could you email Louise White at quarrying.org, because I understand that there's something to do with GDPR regarding that if you're not clicking on the emails and viewing them regularly, you might fall off the list. Is that right, Louise, or could you clarify on that?
Yeah. Send an email to me and I'll try and get it sorted. But there is a question in the chat from Richard Small, just before David Brooke.
Yes, sorry, Richard. Apologies for that. I have missed that. Yes, John, the comment there, kind of comment or question regarding mineral exploration works, that there is the applicability of the borehole sites and operations regulations.
Yeah, Richard's quite right. There are other regulations that might apply. And I think that you can be too prescriptive relating to your looking operations. If you're looking at exploration works, that there are regulations that specifically apply. So, but whether a quarry manager might be responsible for that, or the operator of a quarry might be responsible for that, is a little bit a moot point, I think, at this particular time. I don't know if that helps you at all. One of the real hot topics that, just to add, that has come to the attention of the committee, so I'll finish on that, is outside services that are affected by quarry working. And those are often remote and often hidden in the design process to some extent, because people haven't considered years ago that they would be looking for an impact to your quarry. So just bear that in mind. If you're a geotechnical specialist, you could, if you're a geotechnical assessment or somebody looking at appraisals for a site and saying, are there services associated close to the site, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 meters away, some of these gas mains, could they be affected by our blasting or our operations or earth movements? And just make sure that they're taken into account in your geotechnical assessment.
That's a really good point, and that, that's really.
And again,
the technical assessment, and the operator is aware.
Yes, that's right. And the real problem is, unfortunately, it would come straight back to the quarry man, the 81C guy. They'd say, well, why wasn't this identified as an issue? Didn't you make it known to your geotechnical specialist? And you could quite rightly ask the geotechnical specialist, why didn't you look for it? But it's a bit late then. Okay.
That's a reassuring note. I think we'll bring it to a close there, and I'm expecting a raft of emails thanks to that last comment about services outside the quarry, about service plans coming. So I look forward to those. But so thank you very much, John, for your time today. I hope you've all found that useful. As always, the recording will be available on the Institute of Quarrying website shortly, and I would encourage you to go there and have a look at all of the other webinars that are available. There's usually some fascinating topics which I'm sure you'll find interesting to boost your CPD. But on that note, I hope you all have a good afternoon and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.